My name is Russell Hittinger. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology here at CUA. My notes say it's the nation's leading institute committed to identifying conditions conducive to human flourishing on campus. I want to extend a special thank you to our co-sponsor, the Catholic University's Busch School of Business, and also to our staff, Stephen Higgins, and our managing director, and Caroline O'Callahan. Andrew Abela will moderate our discussion this evening. He's the founding dean of the Busch School of Business, ordinary professor of marketing, widely published in the sphere of the marketing, business ethics, marketing and morality. He is the co-editor of A Catechism for Business from the Catholic University Press and the winner of the 2009 Michael Novak Award for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty. A reminder, we will have some time for questions after the panel, and we invite you to join us for the reception and refreshments afterwards. Now, with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Abela, who will introduce the rest of our speakers, Andrew Yuengert, Father Gregory Pine, and Dean Joseph Capizzi. So we have two deans on this panel. I want to acknowledge Dr. Capizzi's outstanding work as my predecessor at IAG, and for his very important work being Dean of the Pontifical School of Theology. Thank you, Andrew. You can take it from here.
Thank you, Dr. Hittinger. So it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, Professor Andrew Yuengert is a professor of economics at Seaver College at Pepperdine University. He has a PhD from Yale University in economics, and he was the William E. Simon Visiting Fellow in Religion and Public Life at Princeton University. He's been an assistant professor of economics at Bates College, a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and most importantly, for 2 years, a visiting professor at the Busch School of Business. He's also former president of the Association of Christian Economists and editor of its journal, Faith and Economics. Dr. Yuengert is author of 3 books: The Boundaries of Technique, Ordering Positive and Normative Concerns in Economic Research, Inhabiting the Land, The Case for the Right to Migrate, and of course the reason we are here tonight is his new book, Catholic Social Teaching in Practice, Exploring Practical Wisdom and the Virtue Tradition. Please give a warm Catholic welcome to Dr. Yuengert. Actually, Andy, before you start, I'll just introduce the other two, but stay right there. That's okay. That way I won't interrupt the flow with the introductions later on. So next to Dr. Yuengert was Dean Joseph Capizzi, ordinary professor of moral theology, dean of the School of Theology and Religious Studies here at Catholic U. Dr. Capizzi teaches in the areas of social and political theology with special interests in issues in peace and war, citizenship, political authority, and Augustinian theology. Dr. Capizzi has written, lectured, and published widely on just war theory, bioethics, the history of moral theology, political liberalism, and he is the other co-editor of A Catechism for Business. Has a BA from the University of Virginia, a Master's in Theological Studies from Emory University, and an MA and a PhD in Theology from a school in Indiana, whose name I never mention. So please welcome Dr. Capizzi. I think that Professors Yuengert and Capizzi will agree with me that as a professor, you can publish lots of books and scholarly articles. You can get high ratings on Rate My Professor. You can be a president of a national association or dean of a school, but nothing increases your street cred with your college-age children than being on a panel with Father Gregory Pine. So we are very happy to have here with us Father Gregory Pine, who recently completed his doctorate in dogmatic theology at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, was born and raised near Philadelphia, attended the Franciscan University of Steubenville, entered the Order of Preachers upon graduation, was ordained a priest in 2016, holds an STL from the Dominican House of Studies. He is the author of, my third book on my desk here, is Prudence, Choose Carefully, Live Boldly, and co-author of Credo, an RCI program, and also of a Marian Consecration with Aquinas. His writings also appear in Ascension's Catholic Classics series and in Magnificat, and he is a regular contributor to the podcasts Pints with Aquinas and God's Planning. Please welcome Father Pine. You may begin.
Take it away. Is it on? Yeah. So, as you've heard, my training and my modern expert certification are in economics. But my interests have led me to trespass repeatedly into philosophy and theology. I've been fortunate to be met on these forays by friends who, without minimizing my lack of preparation, have suggested readings and encouraged and critiqued my work. This recent book takes me further afield from my base of operations in economics than my previous work, so I'm doubly grateful to Russ Hittinger, to Andrew, Joe, Father Pine for joining me in this conversation. In this book, I want to bring the neo-Aristotelian virtues tradition into a closer conversation with Catholic social teachings principles and its ongoing reflection on those principles. I don't want to rewrite the principles or replace them with the virtues, but a closer engagement with the virtues can make the practical project of Catholic social teaching, social reform in light of the gospel, wiser and more practical. That is, more successful in reforming society in light of the gospel. So I want to begin this conversation with an impossibility theorem. The claim was made by that famous mathematician, George Bernard Shaw. Shaw famously quipped that if all economists relate end to end, they would never reach a conclusion. There's truth in this statement, but I would suggest that if we replace the word economists with the term modern analysis, that the joke would be equally true, not quite as humorous. So it would go this way: if all modern analyses were laid end to end, they would never reach a practical conclusion. My project in this book is part of a larger challenge, the challenge of bringing technical analysis into conversation with practice. Technical analysis narrows our focus on some abstract sketch of reality, defines and measures it, explores its implications. There are empirical analyses that create measures of social phenomena, make statistical assumptions, state carefully what can and cannot be known about the world through empirical work. There are theoretical analyses which trace out the consequences of assumptions to conclusions about economic systems, physics, sociology, almost any discipline, with varying degrees of success and accuracy. There are moral analyses which specify principles of moral evaluation, categorical imperatives, utilitarian calculations, human dignity, benevolence, and explore what those principles mean in modern society. If you take all of these analyses, empirical, theoretical, and moral, and lay them end to end, they will never reach a practical conclusion. That is, a decision. They will never tell you what to do in the specific circumstances into which God has placed you to act. Now, few of us, I wouldn't, would discard the careful insights of technical analysis. Defines our world. Nevertheless, we want more from analysis than it can give us. We want to reduce decision-making to techniques. But between technical analysis and action is a gulf which is not bridgeable by analysis. An analysis traces out the relationships between the precise but imperfect measurements and among abstract concepts and principles. In contrast, any decision about what to do must gauge the distance between measurement, concept, principle, and concrete reality. The gulf between analysis and decision is filled by virtue, and principally by the virtue of practical wisdom, or prudence. Prudence is eminently practical, what Aquinas called right reason applied to action. Virtue finds its purpose in the medium of contingency, of discerning ends, deliberating about means, and acting in this particular time, this particular place. As such, practical wisdom supplies what is missing in technical analysis. But modern analysis doesn't really know what to do with virtue. For one, virtue is not susceptible to analysis. The problem that virtue solves is a problem that analysis can't solve. Practical wisdom is non-analytical in just those ways that are necessary to acting in the world, to bringing the varieties of partial analysis, of personality and character, and the details of application to the point of action. For example, analysis is partial and abstract. Practical wisdom is synthetic. What am I to do? Analysis is conditional. In these conditions, you should do this. Practical wisdom is unconditional. Do this now. Analysis is third person. What should one do in this situation? Practical wisdom is first person. What should I do when the first person suffers or gets the consequences of those actions? Analysis is probabilistic. Practical wisdom must grapple with uncertainty, contingency, when you don't know the probability distributions. In analysis, human beings are acted upon, they're objects. In practical wisdom, human beings are causes, and the system that you're analyzing is open. Moreover, virtue takes us into the realm of moral values. Morals and value, and technical analysis avoids these so as to expand the domain within which it operates. When we try to make decisions in a purely analytical way, or pretend that our analyses are sufficient for good decisions, we abandon a language for discussing what we're doing when we act in the world, in society, in government. We end up with a distorted vision of how to make decisions and often make bad ones. We have many recent examples. Anthony Fauci recently admitted that the 6-foot rule, promoted as the result of scientific research, just sort of appeared. Something like a 6-foot rule should not just appear or be made up. Its specification, and whether there should be a rule at all, is a perfect task for the deliberations of practical wisdom. Unfortunately, if all you have is technique and science, you can't afford to invoke your own wise judgment when making decisions like this. You end up discrediting technical science by asking it to do something that it's unable to do. Make the wise, difficult trade-offs and judgments that are necessary to put a rule into play. When Francis Collins admitted that those making pandemic policy in 2020 adopted a very narrow goal, reduce the mortality rate from COVID, as the only goal of policy, he gave us a clear example of analysis without wisdom. Cardinal Newman taught us that if you don't reflect on the whole of a problem, you end up elevating your narrow expertise into a governing vision. So what does the uneasy relationship of virtue and analysis have to do with Catholic social teaching? The Church's social doctrine bears the marks of many different moral theologies and philosophies. Unsurprisingly, it also bears the marks of modern moral analysis. It describes itself as a set of principles for reflection, criteria for judgment. A partial list of these principles include human dignity, social nature of human beings, subsidiarity, solidarity, the just wage, environmental stewardship, and the wide array of Catholic human rights. The large scholarly and applied literature on Catholic social teaching makes few references to the virtues which apply the principles to the social order. Nevertheless, Catholic social teaching is not purely analytical. First of all, its purpose, social reform in light of the gospel, is undeniably practical. It's supposed to inform and inspire and help lay Christians to act in the world. Second, Catholic social teaching doesn't ignore practical wisdom and the virtues. Even though its focus is social ethics and moral theology, not moral theology, it acknowledges the need for the virtues. It gestures towards the fuller account of virtue in Catholic moral theology. Nonetheless, I argue in this book that the virtues are too implicit in the doctrine. The encyclicals focus on principles and social analysis. Practical wisdom and the virtues are somewhat offstage to be called up when it's time to do something. It's easy to overlook them or to ignore them on purpose. Moreover, many, if not most, of those who read and interpret the tradition are skeptical of the neo-Aristotelian virtues tradition. They're not inclined to explore the role of practical wisdom and the virtues in human action, and instead focus on the development of principles without reference to virtue. In addition, Catholic social teaching is in close dialogue with theoretical and applied social science. These are disciplines which are relentlessly analytical and blind to virtue. Over time, this dialogue can lead even virtue theorists to de-emphasize the virtues in the search for common ground. Consequently, those who study and apply the social doctrine are more likely to overlook or intentionally ignore practical wisdom and the virtues, and are uninterested in how the challenges of practical application might affect the principles. Given the implicit but often ignored place for virtues and practical wisdom in the social tradition of the Church, this book is something of a prudential audit. I want to explore the implications of practical wisdom for our understanding of the social doctrine. Discussions of the place of practical wisdom in Catholic social teaching require the full incorporation of practical wisdom as a virtue, as personal, integrative, embedded in character. It's employed, sometimes well, sometimes poorly, by everyone who exercises responsible agency in society, who confronts concrete problems in contingent circumstances. To the extent that practical wisdom is embedded in individual character, it's also embedded in the structures, relationships, and functioning of society. Consequently, practical wisdom has implications even for theoretical, principle-heavy accounts of Catholic social teaching. When we take practical wisdom seriously as a moral and intellectual virtue, we can trace out 4 consequences for Catholic social teaching. These 4 consequences structure the chapters in this book. Some of these will not be surprising, but will bring into sharper focus what is already present, but sometimes overlooked, in the social doctrine. So first, the perspective of practical wisdom requires a practically personalist conception of society. Human beings have great dignity because they are chosen by God for communion with Him, and they share in God's work in the world. The virtue of practical wisdom gives dynamic expression to the second part of that concept of human dignity, to the human being's work in the world. This implication is the subject of Chapter 4, which argues that practical wisdom can bridge a divide between Catholic social teaching's systemic, macro focus on systems and politics on the one hand, and its purpose as a framework and inspiration for lay action throughout the social order on the other hand. Catholic social teaching promotes a personalist critique of top-down theory and analysis. It's concerned that politics and social science don't overlook human dignity and agency, which are often hidden from their analytical gaze. This personalist counsel is necessary and healthy, but the macro systems perspective does not integrate very well with the micro levels in which most lay Catholics act. Although family ministry, service ministry, youth formation, Catholic social ministry all contribute to Catholic social teaching's project of social renewal, the connections between them are often obscure and lost on the laity. Only voting and political action clearly seem to bring out Catholic social teaching and its principles into play in the lives of most of the laity. They think the other things they're doing aren't Catholic social teaching. So neo-Aristotelian practical wisdom can ground a practical personalism which integrates the macro and micro levels of human action. When practical wisdom is identified at every level of society from the bottom up, the personalist vision becomes vivid and undeniable. Practical wisdom is a virtue, and as such it is exercised by persons. Persons as individuals, local leaders, parents, political leaders, but all persons nonetheless. Consequently, when one is attuned to practical wisdom, one is inclined to focus on the actions of those who exercise it, whatever corner of the social order they inhabit. The widow dropping a mite into the collection box, the father and mother raising a family, the shop owner deciding how to handle a struggling employee, each contribute to the mission of Catholic social teaching. We can acknowledge their contributions without losing sight of the important systemic work of government and institutional reform. We cannot deny the scale of society and the complexity of the social order, but practical wisdom keeps us focused on the multitude of responsible agents within that order. A second implication of practical wisdom is that it highlights the centrality of the laity to the Church's social mission. The unique vocation of the laity in the world requires varieties of practical wisdom at every level: state, local communities, the family. This implication is the subject of chapters 4 and 5. Practical wisdom is not taught in a classroom, but where does it come from? It doesn't come from communicating principles. Practical wisdom and the virtues constitute character, and the experience of action generates the judgments of conscience that are part of character. Character and conscience are practical embodiments of principle, including the principles of Catholic social teaching. Principles of Catholic doctrine will better inform and inspire social reform in light of the gospel when they are embedded in the habits and perceptions of lay Catholics, which is what virtue does. The process of gaining practical wisdom is more like apprenticeship in classroom learning. It's fostered through responsible action and reflection in a community of like-minded persons. Consequently, the quality of the Church's community is paramount in the transmission of practical wisdom and the virtues. A third implication of practical wisdom is for social analysis and for how the Church approaches its collaboration with social science and public policy research. And in this, I focus mostly on economics, because I'm an economist. Social science models must be applied with care if societies are to benefit from their insights while avoiding the pitfalls of their narrow view of human nature. Catholics who are themselves social scientists must exercise a particular kind of practical wisdom that's infused with social charity in formulating and making use of this analysis. Chapters 6 and 7 explore these consequences. I won't say much about Chapter 6, which is about the dialogue between economics and Catholic social thought. Chapter 7 argues that economics is largely an important conversation partner with Catholic social doctrine, but economics is largely blind to neo-Aristotelian virtue. I would argue all the social sciences are. With the rise of behavioral economics, for example, economists do talk more about virtue, but not all virtue is the same. Neo-Aristotelian virtues are not the evolving moral sentiments of David Hume and his successors like Adam Smith and in the behavioral social preference literature. Neither are they the bias-overcoming technical skills of the internal conflict literature. The blindness of economics to virtue does not disqualify it from dialogue. If you can't dialogue with a social science that is blind to virtue, then you can't dialogue with almost all social science. Nevertheless, Catholic social teaching and economics should be aware of these limits to the economic analysis to make better use of it. There's a fourth implication. Practical wisdom puts into sharper perspective the nature of political disagreements among Catholics and between lay Catholics and their bishops. Because disagreement over the application of Catholic social teaching to social problems, these are practical disagreements, they should be understood as disputes over the exercise of practical wisdom in contingent circumstances. They are disagreements among people who share a life and community within relationships marked by teaching authority, and their resolution should challenge and engage both conscience and intellect. So Chapter 8 explores the nature of practical disagreement in the Church. Catholic social teaching is a tradition. It embodies an account of happiness in this life and the next. The Church pursues this vision as a community through the sacraments, prayer, and action in the world. Like other traditions, it is sustained and developed through argument, so it's important to argue well. Because Catholic social teaching informs and inspires a practical project, its principal disagreements are practical. Aquinas outlines the structure of practical human action and the ways in which people can arrive at different practical conclusions are as varied as the structure of the act itself. Practical disagreements may arise due to differences in the way people see society and the human goods which are possible, to differences in the formulation and evaluation of alternative policies and courses of action, or to just differences in the willingness to act. The teaching authority of the Church extends to the social teaching of bishops. For the sake of the Church's mission, the laity should allow themselves to be challenged by the Pope and the bishops. The contingent nature of that teaching, though, entails a respectful, charitable dialogue, if not unquestioning obedience. Consequently, when laity disagree with their bishops over a political program, both parties should examine their consciences. The practical dialogue makes demands on both bishops and on all Catholics. So just to wrap this up, the lens of practical wisdom does not threaten to replace traditional concerns in Catholic social thought about the effects of distorted worldviews, about justice, about charity. Nevertheless, by bringing practical wisdom and the virtues out of the wings and closer to the principles themselves, the body of principles can be enriched. Social analysis can be informed by the doctrine in a more practical way, and the actions of Catholics in the social order can be wiser and more effective in reforming society in the light of the gospel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yuengert. And I'll invite Dean Capizzi to say a few words.
Sure, thank you. I read a lot of books in Catholic social doctrine or teaching over 25 plus years or so. This is truly a remarkable book. Most of the books, if you've read this literature, are relatively thin. Can I call him Andy tonight? Yeah, okay. Andy's is not. It's really a wonderful engagement with the tradition and with our literature that obviously, is relatively new to him, but it does reflect an enormous amount of his own learning from, years of studying, obviously, economics and other points of analysis, technique. Some of the stuff on technique is really phenomenal. And then you add to it a really serious and clear engagement with our own one aspect of our own virtue tradition. And it adds up to an amazing intervention in the literature and I think a necessary one. Now, I say all the nice stuff, right? And then we'll go to a little bit more, questions or things like that. I'm not going to focus too much on the virtue piece of this because I anticipate that Father Pine will focus some of his comments at least on that. But I guess if you had to sum up my concern, it would be roughly, I'm not sure practical wisdom can do what Andy wants it to do. And I don't think it's his fault. And I worry it's actually the Catholic social tradition's fault. And I'll sort of explain that a little bit. So my concern is the Church's project of social reform, which is a term that Andy repeats quite a bit throughout the book. You heard him use it a few times tonight. There are different variations of it in the book itself as well. He talks about the program of social reform, the mission of social reform, etc. My concern is that the wrong description of a project of social reform can actually contribute to the Church's abetting its own irrelevance from its correct project. So what is that? At one point, Andy cites Pope Benedict XVI from Caritas in Veritate. The Church has a mission of truth to accomplish, Andy quotes, which he later paraphrases as, after all, the Church has a mission to accomplish. Okay, and I'm not trying to skewer you, right? But you drop the in truth, right? And the concern, of course, is how does that transform this project that the Church sees herself on? These are quite different possibilities in terms of projects. One could be seen as much more clearly an evangelical project. Like, for instance, and I'm just going to dip into history here and then, the Arguments de las Casas, Bartolome Las Casas, presents in his essay, The Only Way, when he's talking about how to evangelize, and it's very practical. How you evangelize? You have to stop waging war, right? So the primary mission of evangelization requires certain kinds of behavior. It invites people into certain ways of acting. For instance, you're going to go out. You're going to go into the world. You're going to engage other cultures. You're going to speak their languages. You're going to live with them for the purposes of evangelizing them. You're not going to discriminate with regard to race, or he even says at one point, or error, right? You're going to engage people in order to bring to them the Word of God. And that has a very practical conclusion, the mission, understood in that way. God's word is offered to all, and the Christian has to boldly and courageously be ready to go out and meet them. Benedict, I think, makes clear that this is the mission of the church, right? The mission of the church is the service to the truth, and truth, capital T. If you think back to the earliest moments of the appearance of Catholic social doctrine, right, roughly the early, late 19th century, early 20th century, approaches as diverse as the radicalism of a Dorothy Day or a Monsignor Paul Hanley Furphy, who used to teach at Catholic University, on the one hand, and on the other, a Monsignor John Ryan, right, who also used to teach at the Catholic University. Ryan influenced American politics rather directly. Day and Furphy were much more radical, right? They had a very radical approach to what they saw Catholic doctrine inspiring. That kind of diversity manifested itself in response to this. I think it's instructive that over time, the Day-Furphy sort of radical approach really lost to the Monsignor Ryan approach. And I wonder to what extent that was actually a Pyrrhic victory, right? Because Ryan exercised a certain kind of influence over American politics and economics that I'm not sure we do any longer, right? So you can just think again in history, not merely to Ryan. You could think of Martin Luther King being inspired by the social gospel movement. You could think of Richard John Neuhaus much more recently, right, being inspired by both Christian and eventually Catholic social doctrine to engage the world. These were relatively prominent figures, right, who were influencing our economics and our politics at the highest level. To some extent, they kind of bore out the Ryan approach. But where are those guys now? Right? This is my concern. Where is this now? So I want to consider the possibility that overemphasizing the project of social reform or not questioning it and narrowly defining it can distort, and arguably has distorted, Catholic social doctrine. And is that distortion now embedded within Catholic social doctrine itself, which you described as a discipline of social ethics, concerned with macro issues, separated from moral theology, which you describe as concerned with micro issues? I'm a moral theologian. It won't be a surprise for you to know I like to think of Catholic social doctrine as moral theology, right? It is a kind of expression of moral theology, but nonetheless it's moral theology. So, again, I kind of wonder whether what in fact has happened is the more this has become ethics and the less this has become theology, we've kind of abetted our own irrelevance. I'm not attributing this to your book, right, or the faults within the book. I do wonder at sometimes whether you think the practical reason might be the bridge that can reconnect theology and social ethics within the tradition itself. But there are times I think you seem to be saying it is social ethics already. So I'm not sure Catholic social doctrine can be redeemed by looking for the place of practical wisdom or more explicit virtue language within it, but instead by rereading it, not as social ethics at all, and discouraging the church from anything that looks like social ethics in favor of focusing on spreading the gospel. So using the words of the popes, and you quote at least one of these, John Paul II refers to Catholic social doctrine as belonging to the field of theology and particularly of moral theology. The teaching, and this is him still, the teaching and spreading of her social doctrine are part of the church's evangelizing mission. The mission is primary, right? The mission is evangelical. This is Pope Benedict. I think, again, we talked about how it's the mission of proclaiming the truth, right? Pope Francis reiterates this evangelical message in Evangelium Gaudium, locating it in the encounter with Christ. All revealed truths derive from the same divine source and are to be believed with the same faith. Yet some of them are more important for giving direct expression to the heart of the gospel. In this basic core, what shines forth is the beauty of the saving love of God made manifest in Jesus Christ, who died and rose from the dead. So again, I think this is a wonderful intervention in this literature. I think it raises deep questions for the direction of Catholic social doctrine moving forward. And I wonder, again, whether practical wisdom is going to be able to redeem this, unless maybe you're arguing it is this kind of bridge. But even there, I might have some questions as well.
Thank you very much, Dean Capizzi. Now I'd like to turn to Father Pine. So Dean Capizzi is coming from more the Catholic social doctrine perspective. Father Pine, I think, will come from the prudence and virtue perspective. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So I was assigned in 2017, 2018 in Louisville, Kentucky, at our parish of St. Louis Bertrand. And during that time, I was involved in a Catholic campus ministry retreat, which took place at the Mother House of Women's Religious Order. And there were two features of that visit which are emblazoned in my mind. The first was the responsibility for the retreat was assigned to a campus minister who had certain ideas as to what was most important in the Catholic doctrinal tradition. And so she made little pieces of paper that she then had the students choose from and then kind of gather into groups. Those pieces of paper had different principles of Catholic social teaching, and their responsibility was to make posters with the principle at the top and then the various things that they were going to do over the school year so as to implement said principle. And there was no preaching or catechesis prior to the exercise, and I didn't get the impression that there had been preaching or catechesis for some time. And then the students did that, and they kind of brainstormed as their experience of life capacitated them to. One of the things that I remember them resolving to do with dread certainty was buy fair trade coffee. I don't remember much else. Later, at that same retreat, I went over to the chapel. They were to participate in a liturgy celebrated there. And I was informed that I would not be permitted to concelebrate because the women in the congregation took umbrage at concelebration because they weren't permitted to concelebrate. And so these two things are, for whatever reason, emblazoned in my mind. And so I think that it's in these conversations, and this is not by way of correction, it's just by way of accentuation, good to highlight the ecclesiological and the doctrinal setting of these types of questions. And something that I really profited from in reading your book was the connection that you draw between the Catholic social teaching, the virtue tradition, and then the laity as practitioners thereof. Because I think that what we've seen in recent decades is a kind of regnant way of learning and implementing Catholic social teaching, which my experience just adverted to, maybe is emblematic of, but which is largely indebted to Marxism, which is to say it's a kind of dialectical materialism of a low-grade philosophical sort, whereby it's just a mere matter of push and pull. And so, you very helpfully bring to light the fact that it's insufficient just to, quote-unquote, practice social justice or to reform institutions if all that amounts to is technique, because techne, while good, can only get you so far, specifically when it comes to the renewing or, please God, the saving of the practitioners and of those with whom they find themselves engaged. And I think that what we'll often see in these settings is that there's a kind of anti-hierarchical edge. So whenever anyone talks about kind of lay empowerment in these conversations, it's kind of with a disappointed or discouraged gaze on the hierarchy as those who keep them from or otherwise trip them up. And so the clerics who are lauded in these conversations are sometimes those clerics who will sacrifice ecclesial and clerical identity in favor of a kind of, more Marxist, populist leadership. And so I think you get the impression in these types of conversations that the laity does because the hierarchy can't. And my fear is that the laity does because God can't. Not to say that the hierarchy is God, but insofar as the hierarchy are ordained to act instrumentally in a way peculiarly associated with God, in his giving of divine things, I think it sometimes amounts to that. So you see a kind of tacit despair that God can save. And so in the kind of burnt-out husk of a fallen civilization, we may as well build what we can, having been left to our own devices. But I appreciate your vantage because it affords us a fresh perspective, namely in focusing on prudence or practical wisdom, that we are, as agents, afforded a kind of participation in God's providence, right? Because God is good, because he exists, and because he rewards. And that, as the author of the letter to the Hebrews says, it's for these reasons that in recognizing that he is and that he is remunerator, that we draw near to him and he draws near to us. So to express Catholic social teaching not so much as arising from indigence or need on the part of God, but bounty and generosity, that we can participate in it, that we can share in it, because it is his gift. And I think prudence helps bring that into focus, and it affords us, like I said, a fresh perspective. So to kind of focus on this idea of the virtues, the ensemble of the virtues, and especially prudence as concerns practical reason, as instrumental in our transformation, as instrumental in our drawing near to and becoming like God, because it's an effectuation of his providence. So not only are we made recipients, like passive recipients of his divine life, but that we can become agents, active causes in the communication thereof. And Catholic social teaching highlights one particular place in which such transformation is possible. So I think this idea of exercising agency proper to state, that of the laity and that of the hierarchy, affords us an opportunity to embrace our status as protagonists of the work, as not done unto or done against, as not burdened by or otherwise overwhelmed by, but as blessed by. So, I think that your proposal ends up being ultimately more practical, from which I myself profited, and I think your readers will in turn. Because it's not just for us to transform this present evil age as a way by which of alleviating the burden of man's station, but it's for us to transfigure the human community by intimate entry into divine life. And in that sense, we can look at this present evil age as the forecourt of heaven, because as St. Catherine of Siena says, all the way to heaven is heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Pine. When we first started the Busch School 11 years ago, we dedicated ourselves to four of what we thought the main principles of Catholic social doctrine. So human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good. But over the years, through observation, some intuition, and some conversation with Dr. Yuengert, we realized that those principles weren't enough, that something was missing. Hence, now our current focus on virtue. So that we're kind of living out, I think, in some sense, the book that Dr. Yuengert has presented to us. But you've had some interesting commentary from Dean Capizzi and his Sicilian style, and Father Pine. I assume you have some comments to respond to.
I do. By the way, one of the things that inspired sort of the way I approached this was hearing a business school alumna describe her experience in the workplace in terms of those four pillars. I was very impressed that this is not just someone talking about systems, but was talking about my workplace. What does it mean to respect subsidiarity here, solidarity here, human dignity? I said that's an appropriation or an integration of Catholic social teaching into your character and the way you see the world. That isn't just, well, what do I think about markets? What do I think about what government should do, about systems? But it was already operating at that lower level, at that very personal level. And I remember that very strongly, and it inspired the way I try to think about what the laity can do in bringing these principles and making them real in the in the family, in the local community, in their local clubs, in their businesses. So I'm not sure if I'm asking practical, or if we are asking practical wisdom to do what it's supposed to do, because I'm not sure what I'm asking it to do. But in response to what you said, Joe, let's see if the way that I think about it may actually address some of what your concern is. Certainly, and this idea of mission in truth. It does seem to me that one of the sort of divisions within Catholic social teaching, and as you said, John Paul II called it a moral theology, but it seems to me most of the practitioners or people who are researching or trying to apply it are really in social ethics. They're seeing, they're analyzing systems. What are markets like? Are they consistent with this? Or what is particular governing structures like? How should we think about the power structures in society? All at this very systemic level. And I think of that as the domain of social ethics. Not that I don't think it should be integrated in moral theology, but I think some of the difficulty in integrating the virtues into a discussion is really part of that personalist critique of systems, that when you analyze something at a systemic level, you're losing sight. It's very easy when the real things that are happening, right? Anytime you hear a social scientist talk about their discipline to new students, it's like, here's what's really going on. So if what's really going on is at the systemic level, then that's where, if you want to make a difference in society, you need to institute those changes. And as a result, I think the laity are often robbed of the principles because it's either about politics or it's about something that elites do who are very interested in these big questions about what the institutions and the structures of society should be. So one of the things I want to do here, at least in Chapter 4, is to try to give that account of society, that instead of starting up at 30,000 feet with systems and say, oh, by the way, there are human beings here and they're agents and they're of great human dignity, with sort of receiving the grace of us as social scientists and analyzing their situation, but trying to start actually from the ground up, actually. And Russ Hittinger's work sort of grounds the way I think about this. Start, what's a society? Why do people come together? What are the principles and the pillars of Catholic social doctrine when you're talking about the family? And you can find subsidiarity and solidarity, human dignity. Anybody we've all been raised in families and we're raising families, all the principles are right there. And so one of the things I'm concerned to do is to try to not lose sight of those principles everywhere that practical wisdom is exercised in society. One of the things that I think, one of the consequences of this, and one of the things that would be necessary if we took it seriously, I think about what John Paul II calls the subjectivity of society. If you have a society that is sort of rich in this kind of social life, where people are being formed, they're putting into practice, they're bringing the gospel into society and vitalizing it in that way. I think one of the things that will happen in there is that it'll be easy to lose control over what Catholic social teaching is if it's something that is being worked out by people at every level. I think there might be a creativity to Catholic social teaching. If I think about several years ago, another Congressman Ryan, saying, I take Catholic social teaching really seriously. And people who were horrified at that say, how could he take it seriously? He's not the right sort. That would be an effective Catholic social teaching if everybody was trying to figure it out and trying to figure out what does it mean and how can it challenge me? How do I respond to that challenge? You might get very different answers, but that ferment and that I think could be very creative, but it would mean that in some sense the development of Catholic social teaching would be more firmly in the hands of the laity who are at work in society. As I don't know that when I think about what Catholic what practical wisdom can do, I usually think about it in that context.
Do you mind? Okay, so thank you. Here's what bothers me, not about your book, right? What bothers me is, or like perplexes me, causes me to wonder. 1891, Rerum Novarum, and we're off. Catholic social doctrine thing emerges, and we do that, and we have regular documents. 1917, I think, is the social gospel, right? Is that right? Rauschenbusch. And the social gospel, became kind of powerful, etc. It correlates, at least, to the increased irrelevance of Christians from the social, right, and the political, right? I mean, it correlates as well with the decline of the Protestant churches, right? And perhaps the decline of American Catholicism as well. And so what's happening here? If you go to Father Pine's example where he, began by saying, I don't think there was much preaching or catechesis, it was a religious place you were at, right? It was a Catholic institution. Something concerns me about this correlation, and I just wonder to what extent it's stronger than a correlation. And is this a consequence of de-emphasizing the evangelical primacy to which Christians are called? Let's go to another example, right? You used the COVID, right? And I think you said something along the lines of the overarching goal of the COVID policy in the United States was reduce the mortality rate. Well, that's practically wise if you don't believe in an eternal life, right? If you believe this is it, right? You're going to marshal all of your resources towards saving as many lives and extending lives, as much as you can. And it seems quite practically wise to do that, right? So it goes to your point about John Paul II on the social context in which things emerge. So when this stuff arises, you have a Dorothy Day and Furphy and Ryan and et cetera, a public receptive to very different approaches to the inspiration of papal or episcopal intervention into society and politics. We don't have that as much any longer. And are the documents themselves even becoming influenced by this context is more or less the concern at this point. Yeah, I don't want to monopolize. Anyway, that's my concern.
I wonder if we push that argument even further, Father Pine, could we make an argument that if Catholics were truly well-formed in virtue, particularly in the virtue of prudence, practical wisdom, that the benefit, the usefulness of the principles of Catholic social doctrine would be much reduced, because in the normal exercise of prudence, we would make the kinds of decisions that Catholic social doctrine is wishing for us to make? Or is that going too far?
I suppose in listening to Dean Capizzi's comments, my first thought is that perhaps it's a methodological issue, that if one leads with Catholic social teaching, one can give the impression that Catholic social teaching is the point at which one is meant to onboard and the point at which one is meant to stay in his appropriation of the gospel, however so conceived. And I think that you're right to emphasize that Catholic social teaching is downstream of a kind of chain, as it were, of mediations whereby God makes himself known and lovable. And so I think my mind goes to another opportunity during that same year, 2017, 2018. At another institution, I was teaching a class, a senior capstone class, and it was supposed to be Catholic social teaching. So this was kind of like a relic of a Catholic tradition which had since been wholly eviscerated, but they still had it on the books, and so people taught whatever they wanted. And so I took the same liberty, and I named the class Argument in Aquinas. And my thesis was that Catholic social teaching is the fruit of an argument. It's the fruit of an ecclesial argument, and that you need to be initiated into the argument in order to appreciate its findings. And so I had them read some MacIntyre on the dissolution of moral discourse and some Ed Feser on good principles of sound reasoning. And then I had them read Father Thomas Joseph's book, The Light of Christ. So it was like a kind of sneaky RCIA course. And then by the end, we arrived at articles by Russell Hittinger and Father Aquinas Gilbo on those four, kind of pillars, as it were, of Catholic social teaching. So that way they could see them, the deliverance, as the communal efforts of Christians to respond to, our Lord Jesus Christ and his, like revelation and mediation of grace. And so I think that when one insists on that situation, when one insists on that context, obviously great goods are to be gained from it. I think that where we find ourselves tripped up as practitioners thereof is when we begin to think of it as something that it is not, or situated in a place that it ought not be.
I'm pretty sure I agree with what you just said. The gospel's primary. The Catholic social doctrine, making the world around you, better, ministering to it, working with it, making it more human, is secondary. Right? I wondered, one of the things I thought would come up here, and maybe this is related to this, what practical wisdom can do, is I assumed because I was coming to Catholic U and I would have a Dominican talking about my book that one of the shortcomings of what I'm doing would be that I'm not emphasizing enough the infused virtues. I come to this from decades of sort of wrestling with economics and what does economics tell us and what is it leaving out. And so I naturally come into this through the natural virtues. And then I have to, in various chapters, I say, oh, by the way, there are these Christian virtues. There's Christian prudence, and here's how it would make a difference. I wonder if you, and of course, if you're talking about society, talking about the natural virtues makes sense. But I wonder if there might have been a different way to come at it that would have avoided this idea that, well, this is not the onboarding place for it if we started with the infused virtues. I don't know what you think about that, and I don't know enough to know how I should be thinking about that.
No, to be clear, this is not a criticism of your work. It's, I suppose, a criticism of the way in which Catholic social teaching has been practiced and or deployed in the last 50 years. And I think that, when you read book reviews, you begin to identify lazy ways of criticizing. It's like, this translation was suboptimal. It's like, tell me something I don't know. Or this author didn't say everything. It's like, clearly, right? We work within the bounds of our human limitation, which is something that prudence empowers us to do the best with what we have given the time allotted and our own competence. And so I think it's commendable to, take it up as you do. And a lot of people, they'll treat the virtue of justice. They'll typically forget about general justice or legal justice because that tradition has been largely lost in being, assimilated to distributive justice and then eviscerated by social justice. And then we get what we have at present. But like most people just go by way of justice, and I think to go by way of prudence, it's integrative, because prudence is integrative. You made reference to the traditional identification of prudence early on as charioteer of the virtues, right? So prudence, even whilst we don't recognize the properly virtuous character of the intellectual virtues insofar as they don't both make a man good and to act well, prudence does, because it's in living dialogue. Right, so I think that's more important. St. Thomas only dedicates one question to the infused virtues, properly so called, as a kind of formal consideration in the Prima Secundae, and then he just presumes that you're tracking with him, that all of these things have infused and acquired versions, and that they're going to have a different mean given the different formality under which and source and end thereof. But I wouldn't see that as a drawback.
We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. And we have people carrying mics, so there's a gentleman over there.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Great event. I think we're kind of glossing over the fact that technology exists. It's been a lot of after the fact talk. I was wondering, do we just turn off the servers, and who should turn off the servers? Because clearly technology destroys our personal relationship to our leaders, destroys communication. Yeah, so that's my question.
That was of the type you didn't say everything, right? So anybody comment?
I think we need, that's a conversation that we might want to have. I don't know that I can't draw a line from the Catholic social doctrine straight to what you've just said. But this does, I think one of the advantages of being aware of the virtues is to really understand virtue. In the modern world, we think virtue, I'm riffing off what you said, but I'm not actually going to try to give an opinion about whether we should turn off the servers. But I think the good economic answer would be it depends, right? So the fact that I was trained that the answer always starts with it depends makes me a little bit open to the idea of contingency. The fact that I can't just go from my models, even my empirical research, and say, therefore, this has to happen. That's where the actual interesting conversation starts, is once you leave the technical facts and you say, okay, what should we do? Should we turn off the servers? Should we just all sell our, get rid of our, should we get different kinds of smartphones? Should we not have smartphones? Whatever those things are. One of the things I think, one of the healthy consequences of understanding the virtues and practical wisdom is understanding the pervasiveness and importance of contingency in the world. And that scientific research, economic research, social science research assumes away all of that contingency, the fact that to actually get to action, applying something, you have to take a lot of stuff into account that's unique and can't be fit into a measure. I think if people can just get to the point where they just say, well, there's a lot of room for disagreement, and I try to trace this out in one of the chapters of the book on practical disagreements. The social sciences don't narrow the scope for disagreement; they widen it quite broadly. But a good friend of mine who read the book, I was very appreciative, and he read the chapter in which I talk about the scope for disagreement with papal encyclicals and their proposals, and he said, we went from his appreciation of the book to immediately talking about Laudato Si, and the Pope said that this is really that the Paris Accords are really the way to go. This is, you're giving too much authority to a certain kind of a social scientific analysis without any respect for the contingency that opens up wide ranges for disagreement among people of goodwill. And I think it affects the way that Catholic social teaching should be taught, with a respect for the prudence of everybody from Congressman Ryan to I don't know how far over to the left I want to go, but
Bob has a mic to your right.
Thank you. It seems to me that there's a word that, Andy, that you used very often, which could really be helpful for this debate and discussion, which is a laity, which came up very often. And that in your book, you are integrating social science, economics, and social teaching of the church. And we have this debate here regarding the relationship between moral theology evangelization, and the social doctrine of the church. If we have a robust understanding of the laity, as many people in the room like Russ Hittinger have developed and offered in really appreciating the sacrament of baptism and the Tria Munera in the laity, couldn't this be a kind of bridge or a nexus to continue this work of this integration? Because then we have the infused virtues, and then we have the laity understood not simply as the non-clergy, and therefore, but we have the laity as one who is infused by virtue and at the same time has competency in the area of analysis that you also bring into this. Thank you.
I guess I agree. I think a layperson who's formed in the sacraments of the church and the life of the faith, who is also formed in the virtues, is a walking embedded catechism, and much more effective than someone who's sort of learned it in a classroom. If there's a way to, which is why, talking about how lay people are formed in virtue, where that comes from. And it doesn't mean we need to have a diocesan program on virtue formation, but just thinking about where does that come from in the life of a parish, and where do people learn? Is it over the donuts, after Mass? Is it in the nights? There's a lot of virtue being taught and learned in the nights in very informal ways, just in running organizations and trying to live the life of service in connection with the church. So I think an important question is, where does that happen? And how can we make sure it happens? Maybe it's just improving the life of the parish, and more catechesis, more a richer sacramental life that's taken seriously.
This question on this side here.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Great talk. I was just wondering, so you talked a lot about the virtues, the infused virtues, and now obviously prudence that is internal, but in some way also missing from our discussion about Catholic social teaching. And Father also brought something up about the way that social justice has been kind of subsumed the other types of justice, even distributive justice kind of subsuming other types of justice. So can you talk about how that, I guess, even problem in the way that we speak about social justice now in the 21st century, but even the 20th century, even some of the earliest documents of what we now know as like Catholic social teaching, how that affects how we can apply it in the real world in a way that truly speaks to like the virtues and the evangelical nature of the church?
Maybe Father Pine, you had made the comment about the social justice subsuming the other form. Do you want to respond to that?
You can find a good description of the, as it were, the story of legal general justice kind of sliding into social justice in Brian Benested's Church, State, and Society, published by CUA Press. But that's well documented in other sources. And then Father Aquinas Gilbo, who was here, he wrote on the doctrine of the common good, according to Charles de Connick, in his exchange with Jacques Maritain's student. And it also comes up in that conversation. But I think that maybe just to say a brief word about legal justice and then to turn it over. In St. Thomas's estimation, you have this notion of legal or general justice, whereby the part is oriented to the whole. And I think that the fact that we no longer really have a name for that, a placeholder for that in our social experience, makes it difficult for us to identify even the opportunities to evince that type of virtue. And so I think that naming virtues and retaining the names of virtues is an important part, I think, of identifying moral realities and responding to their exigencies. So for instance, the word sobriety. I was recently talking to Tim Paul, who teaches at University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, or at St. Paul, Minnesota. And he was saying, sobriety, it used to signify a moderate use of alcohol, which included, hilarity in certain festive occasions. But now it means the abstinence therefrom, right? So teetotally. And I think that when you lose your hold on the grandeur of the virtues as they embrace the whole of the human reality, you lose your hold on your humanity. So I think that we have kind of low-grade versions of this type of social solidarity with reference to the whole. I think that when you wear an Eagles jersey in the streets of Philadelphia on a Sunday in October, you feel something of it, but not like you might feel it in other higher grade instances. So maybe just to highlight the place of that and then hear what Dr. Yuengert has to say.
That's my understanding of legal, and I think one of the sort of accelerants for the growth in social justice as a way of sort of crowding out the other justices really is the fact that, and I've heard modern Catholic social teaching described in this way, that sometime in the 1800s we started to see society as a system, as a thing. We reified it, and James C. Scott would talk, started to see like a state, right, and to see society. And again, you go into almost any social science intro course, and the way you bring people into it is you think that this is the way you should behave, or this is what's going on, but this is what's really going on, right? That the reality is the reality that the system, in the operations of the system. So if you really want to change, if you really want to make a difference, you need to work at the level of the system. And that's in the sort of the best definition of social justice would be, how do we think about, since it's unavoidable in our modern era that we see systems, we see markets, we see power relations, we see constructed meanings that are not coming from the individuals in the system. So their virtues seem irrelevant to those systems itself. That some of the systems were developed that you can have, we need a bunch of unvirtuous people so we can have a well-functioning system, right? I think that's really where a lot of the air got sucked out. Is that the real important work, the work that all the economists and sociologists are doing, is trying to work on the system, and everything else just sort of recedes into the background because of it. And I think the personalist critique tries to get at that, to say that when you're seeing systems where there are these individuals in that system and they're persons of infinite dignity and worth, that can end up being cashed out in a well, I'm doing this for all the persons who are in this system, and it's really important that we respect their human dignity. I would call that kind of a partial personalism, because you're not seeing them as agents. You're not seeing the work they're doing that's a participation in that divine vocation. So I think there's something for Catholic social teaching to develop in the midst of, which was this change in the way people saw society as something that was separate, above everything that was going on in it. I think the danger there is that, again, most of these social sciences are not capable of giving a description of virtue that respects human agency. Virtue is something that actually comes to you from the system itself. It evolves in your social interactions. It's not something that you develop as a habit. So I think part of it is, I think, the dominance of social science, of seeing society as sort of an engineering problem. What are the levers we need to pull to help make people better off? Because that's what we really care about. And this is where it really can happen, is at the level of social science. So it's kind of heady, but it's also, I could see why people end up de-emphasizing the virtues, because you don't see them from this level of social analysis.
Let's take one last question. The lady in the middle there.
Hello. So my question has to do with how do we explain to those who may be nervous how the virtues in Catholic social teaching actually enrich the social sciences instead of restricting them?
Paul VI, when he talked about the social sciences, I think he was talking about economics, but I'm not sure if he was talking specifically about it. He talked about he praised them, but he also described them as sufficient, insufficient. What was the word he used? He basically said we need the social sciences, right? There's value, there's power, there's understanding that comes from seeing the various social sciences and the way they look at the social order, but they're necessarily insufficient. So I don't think social science. And again, as an economist, I'm not trying to constrain economics. I'm not trying to have an economics of virtue, because I don't think economics is capable in its form as a social science to actually see virtue in the way that Aquinas would see virtue. So, one of the chapter I wrote several years ago was basically trying to say, well, how can you make use of an area of expertise, right, or a social science that can't recognize everything that is important to you? And so I essentially, in C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, there's this group of supernatural allies, the St. Anne's group, and this one person joins them. And of course, they're all Christians except one. One is McPhee is his last name, and he's a Scottish rationalist and atheistic skeptic. And this person who just joined the group says, well, why is he here? What can he contribute? He doesn't see what we see. And the Ransom, the leader of the group, says, well, he's our skeptic, a very important office. So I try to think about economics in that term. But it means that if you're talking to economists and you're looking at their analysis, and I imagine this is true of any social science, it isn't like, well, you have to fully integrate an account of the virtues. It's like, how do you work with a discipline that can't offer you everything that you think is important? And there are sort of really prudential rules for doing that. The first thing is to understand that many of your dialogue partners are going to be blind to things that you think are important to your human flourishing. So how do you take that into account, what they can offer, at the same time, not losing sight of the fact that you can't just adopt the system wholesale because it's not complete. It, as Paul VI said, it mutilates man.
Can I add something to that real quick? I think I read this in your book, right? You addressed this question, right, in the sense of, in a way, you're actually liberating the social sciences to do what they can do best, right, which is give a kind of partial analysis of something. It's when they aspire to do more than that they run into trouble. And if I remember correctly, I think it was your book, and my apologies for my senior moment here, but you point out, like, look, maximization of pleasure, maximization of profit, et cetera, cannot account for a lot of human behavior, why people do what they do. Now, they can be very effective, either of those sorts of approaches, in describing certain things, but if they try to sort of universalize, they're going to fail. And it's because of a distorted vision of the human person, or, et cetera. We can help them, right? The church, as an expert in humanity, right, can help them understand just how they can do their business better. That was you, right?
Take credit for it anyway. I'll take credit for it. But also, I have a list of rules at the end of the chapter where I just say economics cannot assimilate the idea of virtue as the Aristotelian tradition thinks of it. So what does that mean if you think virtue is important and an important part of human flourishing, and you're trying to get advice from economists? And by the way, this is if you are an economist and you also recognize, how do you look at your own discipline, right? How do you approach that? Well, I'm working off of a book by a political scientist named James C. Scott called "Seeing Like a State," where he makes basically the same point. When you see society as a system and you try to engineer it like a system, what are you missing? And he talks about sort of the kinds of knowledge, and he calls it, uses words that are very virtue-like in describing it, but that a state cannot see these things and social science can't see them. So he says, well, basically, be aware of it. That's the first thing. You avoid a lot of damage if you just are aware of the fact that they're blind to this. And then other things like be very suspicious of grand programs to redesign everything, because that can only be done on a reductive system that is leaving out so much of what actually causes a social order to flourish. So you don't want people designing it and coming up with big plans for reform in detail. So James Scott says small steps, right? Don't look for them for big reforms, which of course we look for that as well. But that's a mistake, because the bigger the vision, the more important what you're leaving out is.
So I invite you all to stay and carry on the conversation informally and enjoy some refreshment. Now, please join me in giving a warm thank you to our panelists.